I'm not going to lie. I don't like preseason football. So that must mean I'm against the Jets having an extra preseason game this year, right? Well, I think the Jets are an exception, and I think they're the type of team that will actually benefit from a fourth preseason game. And I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, July 25th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. A championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. So for parts that fit, head to eBay Motors and look for the green check. Stay in the game with eBay Guaranteed Fit, ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. Today we're going to talk about the preseason. The Jets get started a little bit earlier than everybody else. They play the Cleveland Browns in the Hall of Fame game, which is always an extra preseason game. It happens a week before every other team's preseason debut. So the teams that play in the Hall of Fame game essentially have an extra preseason game every year. Back in the days where most teams played 4, this was always the 5th preseason game. Now that everybody plays 3, this is the 4th preseason game. So it's a bonus preseason game for the teams that are part of it. And you had to expect that the Jets would be in this game because they have 2 guys going into the Hall of Fame. And typically, because this game is played in Canton, Ohio, at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and it's played around the time of the induction of that year's Hall of Fame class, with the Jets having 2 players going in, you had to figure they'd be part of it. They always try and tie players who are inducted to the team that plays the game. So we knew it would happen. I do not like preseason football. In fact, I'll tell you this, and maybe this sounds bad as the host of a daily podcast on an NFL team. Nothing makes me happier during a summer night when I have something to do and I don't have to watch a preseason game live. It's just usually not very good football. Usually you're seeing guys at the back of the roster. And of course I end up watching the game on a replay, but I think the games themselves tend to be very uncompelling affairs. And of course, I end up watching them anyway, even if I don't catch them live. But I don't love preseason football. And in all honesty, when I watch these games, I'm hoping for one thing above anything else, and that's just that the Jets avoid injuries, because the most lasting impact of any of these exhibition games are the injuries. If you have a guy who suffers an injury that costs him regular season games, or heaven forbid, somebody suffers an injury that costs them the season, you'll remember that far before you'll remember what the final score of a team's preseason opener was, or the second game, or the third game. The results don't really matter in the preseason. And if anything, I think they tend to get overanalyzed. Guy lighting it up in the exhibition season doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a great player. I think the Jets are an exception this year, though. And I think that the Jets probably benefit from having an extra preseason game. And we're going to talk why. And reason number 1 is Aaron Rodgers. Now, this one, I think that this could be a big deal for the Jets, with the caveat that I'm not totally convinced we're going to see Rodgers much, if at all, in the exhibition season. There's already been talk that the Jets are not going to play their starters in this game in Canton, Ohio against Cleveland, and that's fine. But I look at it from this perspective. Training camp practices are nowhere near as intense as they used to be. There used to be these things. If you haven't been an NFL fan for longer than 10, 15 years, you may not realize that there used to be these things called two-a-days, and it was exactly what it sounded like. There were 2 practices a day. So there was a morning practice and an afternoon practice. So if you were a fan who went to training camp, it could be pretty exciting. You got a full day worth of football action. And on top of that, there's just not as much hitting that goes on. The practices now have been scaled back, and that's partially due to the collective bargaining agreement. And that's essentially the rules of the league that the players and the owners agree to. So if you ever hear about a threat about a lockout or a strike, it comes around maybe once every 10 years if they can't agree to it. That's the reason teams can't really practice as hard as they used to. And there are limits to the amount of days teams can wear pads. It's really scaled back. The players don't want to practice hard. Can't really blame them. So you can't really simulate a game environment the way you used to be able to. So with that in mind, if the Jets play Aaron Rodgers this preseason, and listen, they may not. Aaron Rodgers, it's very possible the Jets may say at 39 years of age, we don't want to risk losing Aaron Rodgers to injury. I actually think I'd play him a little bit, though, because I think it could help him out. It mainly just generating chemistry with his wide receiving group. Now, I know the Jets do have a couple of guys he's familiar with. Of course, they brought in Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb in free agency. But while to a certain extent, you can simulate things, a quarterback throwing to a receiver, and maybe it's less of an issue, the lack of contact on the guys on the outside when it's a receiver trying to beat a corner. I still think that there are just things you cannot simulate in practice. One of them is the quarterback can't get hit in practice. So even when you have defensive linemen bearing down on you, you're not going to get hit. And beyond that, if you've ever seen a training camp practice, you know that the guys up front are kind of going half speed. So not that the Jets necessarily want to risk Rodgers a ton out there, but even though they're practicing together and even though these guys are running the same routes, and I'm sure Rodgers is putting in a lot of work with them, I would not be surprised to find out that Rodgers and the receivers are working after practice ends just to try and get chemistry down. It's not easy. It's not easy. You have to understand the way a receiver is going to run around. You have to understand if he's going to make his break at 5 yards or 7 yards. You kind of have to just understand the nuances of his route running. You have to understand what he's thinking. You always want the quarterback and the receiver to be on the same page. And there are many plays in an NFL playbook where essentially the quarterback and receiver have to read the defense the exact same way. And depending on what the defense throws at you, the receiver may change his route. If a defender plays you one way, you may run left. If a defender plays you another way, you may run right. And you have to understand when the receiver is going to make his read as a quarterback, when he's going to cut, how long it typically takes him when he sees a certain coverage. These are the types of things that just come over time. And the Jets don't, the Jets to an extent, because they have Lazard and Cobb, I think that will be helpful for Rodgers. But the other guys out there, and namely Garrett Wilson, we want to get Garrett Wilson and Aaron Rodgers on the same page. And all the early reports out of training camp are that Garrett Wilson looks phenomenal. And Garrett Wilson's one of those guys. He's already really good. He was already an 1,100-yard receiver as a rookie. So we know that the floor for Garrett Wilson is very high. I feel like in years past, we've had Jets receivers, and Denzel Mims and Elijah Moore are good examples of this, who showed you flashes as rookies, where you say, all right, well, if they play their best more consistently, we've got something. Garrett Wilson, we've already got something. He's already an 1,100-yard receiver. But with Aaron Rodgers and with improvements from year 1 to year 2, can he become like one of the top 5 receivers in the NFL? If it's going to happen, he and Rodgers need to develop good chemistry. So I think that extra preseason game, that could help them out. Now, even if they sit out game 1, maybe it's a situation where they would have sat out game 1 anyway, and this gives them 3 opportunities instead of the 2 that they'd have normally. So we'll keep an eye on it. But I think getting Aaron Rodgers settled, it could be helpful. It could be helpful how he reads defenses the same as his targets, developing chemistry, understanding how the nuances of how they run their routes. I think that this extra game could really be a benefit to Rodgers. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our look at how an extra preseason game may benefit the Jets. We're going to talk about the second quarterback on the roster, Zach Wilson. I don't know how confident the Jets are that they can develop him into something, but I do think that these reps might be helpful for Zach Wilson. I'll discuss why as we continue this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by BetterHelp Online Therapy. Sometimes in life, we are faced with tough choices, and the path forward is not always clear. Whether you're dealing with decisions around career, relationships, or anything else, therapy helps you stay connected to what you really want while you navigate life. so you can move forward with confidence and excitement. Trusting yourself to make decisions that align with your values is like anything. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. Therapy has many benefits. For example, it's helpful learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It is not just for those who have experienced major trauma. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with the licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed. Today, we're talking about the preseason. It's not that far away. Jets and Browns, just about a week away, where they will kick things off in Canton, Ohio. It is a fourth preseason game for the Jets. Most of the teams get three, but because the Jets are in the Hall of Fame game, they get that fourth preseason game. And while I usually hate this exhibition season, this year I see some of the benefits. And we've talked about Aaron Rodgers. Well, of course, there's another fairly high-profile quarterback on the Jets, one who's had a less successful career, and that's Zach Wilson. And I've been clear on this show that I really am not expecting Zach Wilson to develop into much of a player for the Jets, but I view him as kind of the developmental quarterback on this team. And I think it generally speaking, it's good team building to always have one quarterback you're trying to develop at least, who's younger. Usually it's a later round pick, somebody who's a bit of a project. Well, Zach Wilson, of course, was the number 2 overall pick. And so far things have not worked out. And that's why Aaron Rodgers is here. So how could these preseason games benefit Zach Wilson? Well, I'm expecting him to play well because he's going to be an experienced starting quarterback, and he'll be playing against a lot of backups, some third stringers, some guys who may be practice squad candidates. You would think Zach Wilson will play effectively. But I'm going to go back to something I said in the first segment. And that's in training camp, especially these days, you don't really get the live reps that you used to get. And you really don't have any other opportunities to get into game situations where there's not as much pressure. And the NFL is interesting because every other major professional sports league in America, they have some sort of minor league system. The NBA was a late adopter, but they eventually got the D League, which turned into the G League. There's minor league hockey. There's been minor league baseball for decades and decades. There's no minor league NFL team. And I feel like if there was, that's where Zach Wilson would be. Because while I think it can be helpful for him to try and develop on the bench, and that's what the Jets are going to have to do this year, I do think there's something to the idea of getting players game reps to help develop them. If you go back, the NFL never had a minor league, but years and years ago, they did have a developmental league in the summer, NFL Europe, which took place in Europe, and they had a lot of European franchises there. And there were quarterbacks who developed in that league. Kurt Warner played in the NFL Europe. Jake Delhomme, who may not have been a great quarterback, but was at least became effective enough that he started a Super Bowl. He may not have been the driving force behind the Carolina Panthers in 2003, but he did start a Super Bowl. It's not impossible to develop a quarterback on the practice field. Teams have done it. The Jets will try and do it with Zach Wilson this year, but I think there's something to be said to put quarterbacks in games, and not just in any sort of games, but if a quarterback's not ready for the top level of competition, putting them in like a lower pressure situation against competition that's maybe more on their level, that's the type of thing that could help them improve. And it doesn't really exist. And I think it's one of the failures in the NFL. I don't understand why there's no A, developmental league, but B, why there's no minor league. The NFL could certainly afford to do it. And it just would be good for the players. It would give more players an opportunity to actually improve by playing football. League doesn't do it, though. I still can't figure out why not. But the preseason does offer you some opportunities. And same things apply. You actually have to deal with a real pass rush in preseason games. You can be hit as a quarterback. And I don't care what you say. Not that I've ever played quarterback in the NFL, but it can't be the same. Standing back there with the red jersey on in practice, knowing that no matter what happens, even if your offensive line doesn't hold up, you're going to be fine. Nobody's going to really deliver a big hit. Versus in a real game situation, and even in these exhibition contests, you can get hit. There are big hits in these exhibition games. So I would just imagine mentally it's a different picture. And beyond that, again, if you've ever watched one of these training camp practices, what happens in the trenches is it's almost like these guys are going at half speed. You don't really get the full effect of a pass rush. And the pass rushers kind of let up when they get near the quarterback, so you can kind of scramble a little bit more. It's easier to evade the pass rushers because they're not going all out. They're not going at full speed the way they are at games. You don't necessarily need to learn to step up in the pocket as much in practice. I mean, a few years back, I went to Jets training camp when Josh McCown was the quarterback. And pretty much whenever Josh McCown on like half the plays I watched, just decided to scramble because nobody was going to hit him. And it was kind of, and not that it mattered for Josh McCown, who was in his late 30s and was as developed as he was ever going to be. But for a younger quarterback, it showed me that maybe these practices are not as fruitful as they could otherwise be. So I think Zach Wilson will get some opportunities. And again, I'm expecting him to play well in these exhibition games, just due to the standpoint, just due to the fact that he's going to be playing more mop-up duty. It's not going to be like last year where, he was playing with the starters, or 2 years ago when he's playing with the starters. And he did play. If you go back 2 years ago, last year we got hurt immediately. 2 years ago, he actually played pretty well in those exhibition contests and maybe raised expectations to points that were not realistic. But this is going to be an opportunity for him. And it may be the only chance he gets all year to play. I mean, maybe he'll get some reps, a game or two, the fourth quarter of blowouts. Anything happens to Rodgers, he could be in the lineup, but he may not get any other opportunities in a meaningful way to see live game action in the rest of 2023. So this is a real opportunity for Zach Wilson. And look, he's got a long way to go. It's not going to happen overnight. He's not going to be a perfect quarterback by the end of August, but you have to start somewhere. And I feel like these 4 games will be an opportunity for him to take at least the first steps toward trying to revitalize his career. And going back to what I said in the first segment, I don't have a lot of conviction that Rodgers is going to play a lot. I think they should try and put him out there, though. If he doesn't, then that just magnifies the opportunity that awaits Zach Wilson. So Zach Wilson getting a chance in real game situations, but he's not the only one. There are some players near the bottom of the roster who are also going to get a chance, and we'll discuss some of those guys and what these 4 games could mean for them, continuing this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here on this Tuesday, we're talking about this extra preseason game the Jets have in Canton, Ohio. They'll play 4 this year. Most other teams get 3. And normally I hate it because I'd be worried about the injuries for this team, especially a roster that has quite a few older players. Older players tend to get banged up more than younger players. But I do think that this year in particular, the Jets could benefit. And a lot of that has to do with their quarterback situation. But there are some other guys who could really use the reps. And I'm going to get to some of the younger developmental players, but there's actually a guy who's closer to the front of the roster who I think will benefit from a little extra game action if the Jets put him out there again. And that's Makai Beckton. And I feel like Beckton, there's going to be some rust he's going to have to shake off just because he hasn't played a real game since 2020, unless you want to count those 3 quarters against Carolina 2 years ago. Or I guess you could count some of the preseason stuff. Well, even then, that's 2 full years since he's played a real meaningful game. So it'll just be an opportunity for him to get out there. And I also feel like, and I haven't heard this from Beckton, but I have heard this from other players who have recovered from serious injuries. Sometimes just mentally, you need to get out there and get hit and throw a block or 2 just to get yourself to relax, because the idea that you've been injured is always kind of looming over your head, and you're always a little bit worried until you go out there and prove you can do it. So for somebody like Makai Beckton, I think this could be a real opportunity. Now, I think there are also opportunities, and this goes along with the lines of what I've been saying about everybody else. Training camp, not really an opportunity to develop. I've heard players. I remember hearing from Herm Edwards, former Jets coach who played with the Philadelphia Eagles decades ago. I remember him once talking about how training camp in his day, that was a chance as a late round draft pick to show what you could do, to show that, you could make it in this league, because those practices were so much more intense. And the practices being less intense these days mean that coaches can't take as much seriously that comes from these workouts. So these games are really your only opportunity to simulate what happens on the field. And I think you always look to guys who are looking to develop later round picks. So Jermaine Johnson, not a later round pick, of course, a first round pick, but a guy looking to develop. If we're looking at later round picks, maybe a Max Mitchell, who I think is going to hope that he takes a big step between year 1 and year 2. And the Jets certainly, I think after what we went through last season, Jets certainly could use some depth up front on that offensive line. And a guy, if Mitchell can develop into a guy who plays effectively, who's added some bulk, maybe won't be pushed around as much this year, that could be no small thing for this team. You could also look to later round picks this year. How about a Zaire Barnes? Guys trying to make the team as a linebacker, maybe a special teamer, an opportunity for him to go out there, prove himself, also get the reps that he needs. And Izzy Abanikanda, who could play a legitimate role on this team. Well, what better opportunity is there than going out there in the preseason and showing, and one of the things I always look for these maybe later round picks who could carve out a role on the team, do they look way better than everybody else? Because the later round picks usually play the third and fourth quarter of these games. And these players they're up against, they're usually like fringe roster players. They may be guys who are going to be on a practice squad. Some guys aren't even going to be on the practice squad. You have to remember teams bring 90 players to training camp. So an extra game is just an extra chance for you to show that you belong. And if you're like a day 3 pick who's playing the third, fourth quarter of preseason game and you look like a star, that's a sign that maybe there's something there. Not always. David Clowney, there was a Jets receiver back in like 2008, 2009 who dominated the fourth quarter of preseason games and was never really heard from in real games. But sometimes there's a guy who just flashes out and you look at him and you say, that guy doesn't belong there. That guy belongs playing earlier. That guy looks like he can make this team. So something worth watching, of course. And I think that, we'll see who the surprises are. Usually there's at least 1 or 2 surprises you see late in these games, a developmental player who stands out and ends up carving out a role on the team. We'll figure out who that guy is as we move into the preseason. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on the podcast source, give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions tomorrow. We've got our Wednesday weekly mailbag.